It was a crisp evening in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. The local McDonald's on West 25th Street buzzed with life, its fluorescent lights reflecting off the black and white tiled floor. Inside, firefighters with soot-streaked faces, EMTs in navy blue uniforms, and police officers adjusting their gear belts filled the space. The air carried the hum of light-hearted laughter and the comforting aroma of fries and sizzling burgers. For a moment, this fast food hub became a haven, where the weight of their long, exhausting shifts melted away. Among the lively crowd, the glass doors swung open, letting in a young man. Tall and understated, he wore a gray hoodie and dark sneakers, his hands tucked into his pockets. His quiet energy seemed almost deliberate, as if he wanted to blend into the bustling scene. A few customers glanced at him, noting his strikingly familiar face, though none immediately placed it. This was Barron Trump, the former first son of the United States. Barron moved toward the counter with an unassuming demeanor, standing behind a firefighter whose uniform carried faint traces of smoke. He wasn't looking for attention. He seemed almost determined to avoid it. The restaurant buzzed on, the rhythmic sound of the fryer and the chatter of customers providing a backdrop. As Barron waited his turn, the firefighter in front exchanged light-hearted banter with his colleague. "Man, I thought that roof was coming down for sure," one of them said, shaking his head. Barron glanced back briefly, his gaze meeting theirs in a moment of quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't about who he was, but about a shared respect for the grit and determination of their work. When it was finally his turn at the counter, the young cashier greeted him with a practiced smile. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with recognition, but Barron's calm tone as he placed his order disarmed her curiosity. "Just a moment," she said, her fingers deftly punching in his request. Behind him, the firefighter continued chatting with his colleague, their conversation a mix of pride and exhaustion. Barron stood quietly, absorbing the weight of their words without interrupting. The room's energy remained lively, but Barron's quiet presence would soon bring about a ripple that no one expected. After receiving his receipt, Barron leaned in toward the cashier and spoke softly. She froze for a moment, her eyes widening in surprise as she tried to process his words. "Are you serious?" she whispered. He nodded, glancing discreetly at the tables filled with first responders. What Barron had said sparked a subtle change in the staff. The cashier relayed his instructions to her manager, who raised an eyebrow before nodding in approval. The kitchen staff, catching wind of what was happening, began moving with quiet urgency. Conversations behind the counter turned into hushed whispers, and some employees exchanged curious glances. Meanwhile, Barron stepped aside, waiting calmly with his drink in hand, his expression unreadable. For now, the dining room remained unaware of what was unfolding. But the chain of events Barron had set in motion was about to leave an indelible mark on everyone inside. As the cashier quietly conveyed Barron's request to her manager, the atmosphere behind the counter shifted. The staff began working with heightened focus, assembling meals at a pace typically reserved for peak rush hours. Yet, the dining area remained unaware of the subtle buzz unfolding in the background. Barron stood to the side, near the soda fountain, his hands casually tucked into his hoodie's pockets. His calm demeanor and unobtrusive stance ensured that no one immediately connected him to the growing activity behind the counter. Instead, the first responders carried on with their meals and conversations, oblivious to the gesture that was about to redefine their evening. Soon, the cashier began calling out orders for the first responders, her tone more animated than before. As each firefighter, EMT, or police officer approached the counter to retrieve their food, they were met with the same line. "It's already been taken care of." Confused, the first responders hesitated. "By who?" one firefighter asked, his brow furrowed as he glanced around the room. The cashier, with a discreet gesture, indicated the young man near the soda fountain. Barron, keeping his head low, didn't react to the subtle pointing. He remained where he was, sipping his drink as if nothing unusual had happened. The realization spread quickly. A few whispered his name, putting the pieces together. "That's Trump's kid, isn't it?" "Barron," one firefighter murmured to his colleague, his tone laced with surprise. "What's he doing here?" another asked, glancing toward Barron with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Despite the whispers and glances directed his way, no one approached him. It wasn't out of fear or intimidation. It was respect. Barron's actions spoke louder than any explanation or announcement ever could. His quiet humility in paying for their meals, without seeking recognition, left an impact that silenced the room. Gradually, the chatter about work and emergencies gave way to conversations about the unexpected gesture. "Did you see him? He didn't even look up when she pointed," an EMT said, shaking her head in amazement. "Yeah," her colleague replied. "It's like he didn't want anyone to know." As more meals were handed out, the mood in the room shifted from confusion to admiration. First responders, accustomed to acts of gratitude expressed in handshakes or words, found themselves grappling with something deeper, a moment of genuine kindness that felt almost surreal. At a table in the back, a firefighter unwrapped his burger, his expression thoughtful. "He could have just walked in and out like anyone else," he said, his voice low. "But he didn't. That says a lot." Nearby, a young EMT chuckled softly as she stared at the warm bag of food in her hands. "You don't see stuff like this every day," she said. "Not from someone like him." Even the McDonald's staff couldn't contain their awe. The cashier recounted the moment Barron leaned in to make his request, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I thought he was joking," she said, glancing toward the manager. "But he wasn't. He just said it so calmly, like it was no big deal." Behind the counter, the kitchen crew exchanged stories, their admiration evident. For them, this wasn't just another shift. It was a moment they'd remember long after the night ended. As the realization of Barron's actions rippled through the room, the first responders began looking at each other differently. There was a shared sense of gratitude, not just for the free meals but for the acknowledgement that came with them. In their line of work, moments like these were rare. One police officer, raising his soda cup in a quiet toast, broke the silence. "Well," he said, his tone warm, "here's to him, whoever he is." The room responded with soft laughter, a ripple of light-heartedness breaking through the initial disbelief. For the first time that night, the first responders weren't just colleagues. They were a group united by an act of kindness they hadn't expected. Meanwhile, Barron remained near the window, watching the reactions unfold without inserting himself into the moment. His quiet resolve to stay in the background only deepened the respect people felt for him. As the buzz of gratitude and admiration grew louder, the young man who had sparked it all quietly prepared to leave. As the last of the meals were handed out, the realization of Barron's gesture settled over the room like a warm blanket. Conversations about their shifts and emergencies faded, replaced by murmurs of disbelief and gratitude. First responders, used to being acknowledged in passing, now found themselves reflecting on a rare act of kindness. "He didn't have to do this," one police officer muttered, staring at the bag of food in his hands. "He could have just come in, ordered, and left like anyone else." The sentiment was echoed around the room. At a nearby table, a firefighter leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "Yeah," he said, nodding toward the young man by the window. "But he did. That's what makes it different." Barron remained in his quiet corner, seemingly detached from the growing whispers around him. He finished his drink with measured calm, his eyes occasionally glancing out the window as if to avoid the attention he knew was building. The quiet humility in his actions struck a chord with everyone present. "Is that really him?" an EMT near the counter asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Yeah," the cashier confirmed with a slight nod. "That's Barron Trump." The name carried weight, but not in the way one might expect. Instead of sparking discussions about his status or his family, the focus remained on what he had done. His actions had transcended titles and expectations, leaving behind an impression of simple, unspoken humanity. As Barron prepared to leave, the energy in the room shifted again. Conversations quieted, and glances followed his every move. It wasn't out of curiosity anymore. It was respect. The young man in the gray hoodie had managed to make them feel seen and valued in a way that words couldn't. At a back table, a paramedic leaned forward, speaking softly to her colleague. "Do you think he even realizes what he just did?" she asked. Her colleague shook his head, smiling faintly. I think he knows, but I don't think he cares about the attention. Barron adjusted his hoodie and moved toward the exit, his steps unhurried. The glass doors reflected the fluorescent lights inside, creating a soft glow that framed his silhouette. For a moment, it seemed as though he might stop, perhaps to acknowledge the room or say a word of thanks. But he didn't. Instead, he pushed open the doors and stepped out into the brisk Cleveland evening. Inside, the first responders watched him go, their meals in front of them and a mix of emotions on their faces. Gratitude, admiration, and a hint of disbelief lingered in the air. A firefighter at the back of the room leaned forward, his hands clasped around his coffee cup. "You don't see that every day," he said, "especially from someone like him." Near the window, a young EMT gazed outside, watching Barron's figure fade into the night. "It's funny," she mused, almost to herself. "People think the world's too big for one small act to matter. But it's moments like this that remind you it's not." Her words hung in the air, resonating with those around her. The first responders exchanged glances, their expressions reflective. Barron's quiet exit left behind a room full of people deeply moved, not just by his generosity, but by the reminder that their efforts mattered. Outside, Barron paused briefly on the sidewalk. He glanced back toward the McDonald's, his face unreadable. For a moment, he seemed to take in the muffled buzz of conversations from inside. Then, with the same quiet demeanor he had carried all evening, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the city lights. Back inside the McDonald's, the room was alive with hushed conversations, but the tone had shifted. The chatter wasn't about the emergencies they had faced earlier or the challenges of their jobs. It was about Barron Trump's unexpected gesture. "He didn't even wait for a thank you," an EMT remarked, her voice tinged with wonder as she unwrapped her meal. "It's like he wanted to stay invisible." At another table, a police officer leaned back in his chair, staring at his untouched food. "It's not about the money," he said, his tone reflective. "It's the thought. The fact that he chose to do this, quietly, without anyone asking." Across the room, a firefighter added, "People thank us all the time, but this feels different. It's not words, it's action. And that means a lot." The cashier, still processing the moment, shared her story with the kitchen crew. "I couldn't believe it," she said. "When he leaned in and told me what he wanted to do, I thought it was a joke. But he was serious, dead serious." Her words rippled through the small group of employees. For them, this wasn't just another night on the job. It was a moment they'd carry with them, a reminder that even in the most routine settings, extraordinary acts of kindness could happen. Near the window, the young EMT who had watched Barron leave spoke up again. "You think he knows how much this meant to us?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on the now empty street outside. A firefighter at the next table replied, "Maybe he does, but I don't think that's why he did it. That's what makes it so real." The conversations gradually shifted, delving deeper into what Barron's actions represented. It wasn't just about the free meals. It was about being seen, about feeling appreciated in a way that was rare for people in their line of work. One paramedic, sipping her coffee, shared her thoughts. "We see so much in this job," she said softly. "Pain, loss, chaos. It's easy to get jaded. But tonight was different. It reminded me why we do this." Others nodded in agreement. The room buzzed with a shared sense of gratitude, not just for the meals but for the quiet acknowledgement of their service. As the night wore on, the first responders finished their meals and prepared to leave. But the memory of Barron's gesture lingered, sparking reflections that extended beyond the confines of the restaurant. "It's the small things that stick with you," a police officer said as he stood to leave. "The moments that remind you people still care." Meanwhile, outside the McDonald's, the story of what had happened inside began to spread. A passerby who had recognized Barron posted a brief note on social media. "Just saw Barron Trump at McDonald's. He quietly paid for meals for a room full of first responders. No cameras, no entourage, just kindness. Respect." The post gained traction almost immediately, sparking discussions online. People debated the gesture, some focusing on Barron's family name while others praised his humility. But for those who had been inside the restaurant that night, the debates didn't matter. They knew the truth. Inside, A seasoned firefighter summed it up best. "We don't get moments like this often," he said, adjusting his jacket. "But when we do, it reminds us why we keep going." As the last of the first responders filtered out, the McDonald's staff exchanged quiet glances, still marveling at the night's events. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" one of the kitchen crew asked. The cashier smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Maybe, but even if we don't, we'll never forget this." For those who had witnessed Barron's gesture, it wasn't just an act of generosity. It was a reminder of the power of kindness. In a world often divided by titles and expectations, his actions had cut through the noise, leaving behind an echo of humanity that would resonate far beyond that small McDonald's in Cleveland.